r/malicious compliance. First story. Tenant asking landlord, me, to be more professional. I'm a small-time landlord with just 4 tenants. Earlier this year, I had 2 sisters that didn't respond to my requests to add of the gal's husband to the lease, though he was living with them. Not a big deal, but did I mention the pit bull they also brought home without permission? I do allow pets and had previously approved their other dog. I asked nicely in person and by email in the months leading up to the malicious compliance. They also did not respond when I asked if they were happy there and wanted to renew their lease for the following year. I asked again. Then I emailed them notice that I would start showing the unit 2 days later. I try to be a nice landlord. I do. They had a newborn as well, so I scheduled all of the showings within a 2-hour window on the same night so I could be in their space as little as possible. Also, because they had not responded and it was now serious crunch time for getting another tenant and my spouse worked all the following 2 weeks during evening showing hours, I had the delightful inconvenience of bringing my 2- and 6-year-old children with me to the showings. Because I'm not a corporation, I'm a small-time family landlord with kids. Try to imagine how difficult it is to conduct business meetings with 2 kids, right? Then imagine staggering showings every 15 minutes with prospective tenants who are also bringing their own kids. Just to further clutter your imagination, this is an 800 square foot 2-bedroom apartment with a cozy entryway. So I arrive with my 2 kids to find that my tenants are still at home, along with the husband, the newborn and the other sister's boyfriend. So that's 7 people in a small kitchen already. Then the first prospective tenants start arriving. Husbands, wives, with kids, and some showing up early, so there's 2 sets of them. That's 14 people in a small kitchen. And I'm a mom. I have magical powers. So I'm holding my toddler, my daughter is safely under the dining table coloring, and I'm chatting with the prospective tenants and directing traffic while my actual tenants prepare to depart. If you didn't know this already, it's common practice in the US to leave the premises during real estate or apartment showings. This was their first apartment, so I actually emailed them ahead of time to let them know what is generally expected at showings. For instance, a relatively tidy apartment, and that they can leave for their own convenience. They do eventually leave after the boyfriend tells a prospective tenant that he, in fact, also lives there. And I carry on with an exhausting scheduling of showings and have my new tenants all picked out and lease signed by the next day. Awesome, right? The next night, I get a voicemail from the husband, who is not my tenant. I saved it and just listened to it again because it still gives me that same delightful shiver of malicious compliance. In his voicemail, he told me how awful it was that my children touched his infant's things. They didn't, because I keep my kids entertained with magical mommy toys, but prospective tenants also brought children, and how they had to sterilize everything to keep their infant from being sick, and how inconvenient it was to have showings with only 2 days notice, and how very unprofessional I was to bring my children. And asked if I could just be more professional in the future. You can hear it, can't you? The deep shiver of malicious compliance vibrating through my offended being. The next morning, I started issuing professional lease violation notices. One for the extra residents of the unit, hubby, and boyfriend. One for the extra dog. And a few additional ones for building concerns I noted during the showings. They ignored the violation notice, which I sent by certified mail, and, thoughtfully, also by email. I decided to be even more professional 30 days later and issue a 5-day notice to vacate. And I called their mom, who is their emergency contact, as an eviction notice is an emergency. Did I mention that their lease was due to end just a few weeks later? But it would be unprofessional of me to let these violations slide until then. 3 days later, they'd magically sent me all the information I'd requested, removed the other dog, licensed the first dog, gotten the required pet insurance. They moved out on their lease termination date and skipped out on their last electric bill and left the unit in damaged condition. Despite my professional security deposit disposition statement and request for payment, they ignored those notices until I stated I would proceed to small claims court by X date for the total due beyond their security deposit. On X date, they replied stating they didn't think it was fair that they should have to cover damages to the unit or pay any more money toward their utility bill. Yep. 2 months later, there we were in the lobby of the courthouse, sitting across from each other on uncomfortable waiting room benches. They're laughing among themselves about how they are going to get their full security deposit back. And I'm quietly reviewing my presentation notes to the judge and my sizable stack of evidence, photographs, videos. This was my first time in court, but I wasn't laughing. I was preparing. 1 hour later, we are back in the lobby and their mom is trying to write me a check for the full amount of the judgment. She doesn't have a pen. Her kids don't have a pen. I, however, have a pen. I cheerfully offer my pen. She writes the check and hands it to me. And, wait. I hold my hand again. Got my pen back too. I was so proud of myself for not saying any of the sassy things in my head in that moment. You know why? Because I was being professional, as I'd been from the moment he'd left that voicemail. As a last note, I do acknowledge that it would have been better if I hadn't brought my children. However, if you have kids, you'll understand that sometimes they simply have to go where you go. Second story. Military spouse accuses me of cheating on my husband, with my husband. I've been living in Japan for a little over 2 years with my husband. He was born here, and we decided to move to his hometown. It's a small city, but there's enough to do without getting bored. I'd describe us as an AMWF couple, Asian man, white female for those who don't know. It's not so common in Western countries, and it can feel like we are some rare shiny Pokemon as AMWF in rural Japan. Lots of staring, occasional secret picture, or even small chats. If an old lady is brave enough to approach us, it can feel uncomfortable eating at a restaurant, because kids will turn around in their seat and stare at us the whole time with an open fish mouth. Coincidentally, there's a small US military base located in this city. The closer you are downtown, the more American families you see. I'm constantly mistaken for being military by Americans and Japanese, which is understandable. Besides myself, I only know 5 other interracial marriages here. It's always locals who ask about my American husband when I'm out alone, which I respond in Japanese, watashi no oto wa nihonjin desu. Koko en isundimasu, my husband is Japanese, and I live here, or something along those lines. Americans never ask about my marriage as they assume my spouse is American. When we are together in public, we do abnormal couples behavior such as holding hands. No, couples rarely hold hands in public, let alone say I love you. We don't go downtown too often, since it's all pay to park, and it's a nightmare to find a place. It was a beautiful warm day for the first time in months, but we decided to battle for a spot and walk around the shops. The crowd was heavy, since the weather was great and winter was ending. The season for new American families to move here just finished, so I'm sure this was many people's first time to leisurely walk and shop outside. We find a parking spot and made our way to the outside shops. Of course, we are holding hands and casually talking and laughing. Wow. I hear this from an American woman about 10 feet behind us. You should know that a Japanese stereotype against Americans is that we are rudely and obnoxiously loud. And this wow was loud enough for me to turn my head around at the noise. She was with 2 other moms who had like 3 kids each. They were staring at me, but perhaps we just accidentally had eye contact at the right time. Seriously, another little homewrecker is doing this in public? Chill, woman, you're so loud even I can hear you. We find a table nearby at the Starbucks outside. We are enjoying our drinks when the same group of women approached us with their strollers in tow. They definitely had some sort of purpose with something to say to us. Let's call her Honor, woman in Japanese. Honor, excuse me, but you need to keep whatever you're doing in your messed up home. Doing that in public in front of families to see is disgusting and immoral. My kids don't need to see such a bad display of marriage. I'm so confused, as was my husband who can speak English. Who knew drinking coffee outside was a crime against humanity and marriage? Me, I backquote am sorry. What did we do? Honor, you know exactly what you're doing. Asterisk SHE points to my wedding ring. Me, no, I don't. Honor, good lord, does your husband know about this? Is he on a ship right now? That's so like a dependopotamus. Her friends laugh. In case you don't speak military, a dependopotamus is slang for a military wife who stays at home all day, doesn't clean, uses their spouse as an ATM, and looks like Jabba the Hutt. It dawns on me, she thinks I'm a military spouse and I'm cheating on my American husband. I started laughing because she's suggesting I'm cheating on my husband with my husband. Me, this is my spouse. I'm actually not part of the military community and have a Japanese visa. Anna looks at my significant other up and down. The two women behind her apologize, but the Anna didn't believe it. Anna, no one would voluntarily want to live in this little town. Nice lie, but you're not representing the military community. You make all of us wives look like whores. Who is your husband, and what's his rank? Also, I need your dependent ID. My husband is a high rank, so he'll make sure your husband is aware of your infidelity. She pulls out her phone to probably type my response. I'm offended since this is actually a nice place to live, and very open to foreigners. Me, look, my husband's name is Ryi, not his real name. I don't want to reveal personal info, and he's sitting right here. I'm not going to show you my military ID, since I don't have one, and you're not the police. As proof, you can obviously see our wedding bands match, and here's a picture. I show her my phone screen, which is of us in traditional Japanese clothes on our wedding day. Her eyes became huge at the picture. Her two friends and their spawn have already started walking away. Anna, why are you in a relationship with him? You should be in a normal relationship and start having a family with American kids. She says some other statements which I'd consider racist against the Asian race. It's so ironic, because we are in Japan, and she's fussing about me being married to a Japanese man. My husband has been quiet throughout the whole exchange, and says to me we should go. I agree and stood up. Me, stop. The things you are saying are extremely offensive. I was part of the military community myself some years ago, and what you're doing is against spousal conduct. She smirked. Go ahead and tell people what I did, then. My high-ranking husband is an E7, and everything will be swept under the rug, no matter what happens. You can't touch me. So that's what I did. Note, this is a small military community. Someone does something minor and it's talked about between wives like chickens. Later that day, I run into my friend who works on the base, and she's well known in the community for being one of the main event coordinators. I don't miss this chance to comply with Anna's demand and explain to my friend about the exchange and how it made my husband extremely uncomfortable with her remarks. She asked me if this person looked like so and so, which I said yes. My friend rolls her eyes. Friend, she just arrived a couple months ago and is already causing problems with rumors and drama. Looks like we have a racist too. I'll make sure what she said is passed on. It's been half a year later, and I didn't hear anything about Anna again, since I distanced myself from making military friends here. I've only been in my new city for a little over 2 years, and experienced more drama from military families than I have my whole high school career. That is, until now. Last week, I ran into my friend who's getting ready to leave back to the United States. We had a little discussion about her moving, and my family planning, and dropped a bombshell. Friend, do you remember Anna, who accused you of cheating on your non-existent military spouse and called your husband a racist name? Me, of course. I haven't heard anything from her since. Friend, well, I mentioned we were already having problems with her not long after she got here. I told my boss that there's a person who was bothering and threatening civilians and asking for IDs, which isn't allowed for someone with her status. My boss was extremely interested after I mentioned her name because Anna was scheduled for an interview in my department. I suggested we look at her social media accounts from her past behavior because we don't tolerate racism. It was easy to find her Twitter and Facebook, particularly Facebook since we have many mutual friends. Her SNS was shocking. While she set her Facebook to private, her Twitter was littered with malicious tweets and retweets. This included racism slang for many nationalities, colorful language, and using her husband's military rank to bully others. She made it very clear that she wants to see her current city burn to the ground, and why would anyone want to learn Japanese, since it sounds terrible. We printed some of the more extreme things she posted, and we still invited her to the interview. Oh, and did I mention my boss is Japanese? So she comes into the interview, which I was part of. I asked 3 good things about her, which is she says dependent, gets things done, and friendly. My boss just looked at her for a second before he pulled out her tweets. and asked her to explain how she can friendly serve the local community if she hates it so much. Honor was flawed and said someone hacked into her account, despite there being at least 3 years of slanderous tweets. We thanked her for coming and said we can't accept an employee with this conduct. As far as I know, she's still not working because some spouses found her Twitter not long after the interview and was shared in all departments. No one will touch her application now. Me. So all of this was discovered because I told you about her accusations? Friend, yes. Oh, and she's kind of an outcast socially right now because she cheated on her husband a couple months ago. There you have it, folks. Because one person couldn't mind their own business, they lost a potential job and had their social media exposed. Super ironic since she became the dependopotamus and adulterer, the same thing she was accusing me of. Edit since some posts say it's fake because my writing sucks. This is how I tell my stories online.